Well. Last week, I quit the Labour Party, which I've supported for the 2 decades or so of my adult life, to support a new initiative. We Deserve Better. That'll support candidates who are Green Party or independent or indeed Labour candidates using a pragmatic criteria. What do they stand for? Do they support taxing the rich, investing in our collapsing public services, public ownership, radical action to tackle the climate emergency with policies which create good jobs and improve our living standards and, crucially, don't support war crimes? I know what you're thinking. What an unreasonable and deranged extremist I am. Now, anyway, my opposition to Israel's genocidal war on Gaza and Labour's refusal to condemn war crimes is absolutely a huge, crucial part of why, of course, I left. So I went on the newsagent's podcast to discuss all of this, and I was interviewed by the former BBC journalist Lewis Goodall. Now, I should start by saying I have a huge amount of respect and time for Lewis. I think he's head and shoulders above most British journalists. Because he's intellectually curious above all else and he knows his stuff. So when he interviewed me, he put me under real pressure, which I would obviously expect a good journalist to do, but not pressure that was just bad faith or disingenuous or anything like that. You can listen to the whole interview on the Newsagent's show, wherever you download your podcast. But here's a segment about my local Labour MP and the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry.
Do you think cutting off food, water and electricity is within international law?
I think that Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism.
That's not the question I asked.
It is an answer to the question that you've asked, and I think it's an appropriate one at this time.
I've always liked Emily. Always got on very, very well with Emily. I've got pissed with her, campaigned with her repeatedly. Someone I've always just had a huge amount of warmth for, even when I don't agree with her. I spoke out what I thought was the sexism of the 2020 leadership election, where I thought she was more charismatic than Keir Starmer, came from a similar place, and look what happened to her. I thought that said a lot about the Labour Party sexism at the time, to be honest. What I'd say about Emily is she went on national television and she was asked repeatedly by the brilliant BBC journalist Victoria Derbyshire, is cutting off water, food and energy against international law? Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Attorney General, quite literally in charge of the legal area of the Labour Party in terms of prospective government, and a lawyer, knows that cutting off water, food, medicine, anything else is a war crime. It's a war crime. And we can see that war crime now playing out in terms of starvation and children dying in their thousands, and innocent civilians, men, women and children dying in their thousands, and one of the great atrocities of our age. Now, when she went on television, when she saw that, and I watched that, I felt sick. I actually felt sick. I actually felt nauseous. And I just don't understand. Sometimes I kind of feel like I've just entered a parallel universe. That's, in terms of what's happened since the 7th of October, when horrendous atrocities were committed by Hamas against innocent Israeli civilians. And then ever since, tens of thousands of Palestinians have been slaughtered. I feel like I've entered into a parallel universe where there is not even a pretense of people having a basic moral code and just decency, and just allowing and standing by and legitimising a grave atrocity. And she must know by going on television at that moment and making that case, she helped legitimise the war crimes which were already being exacted, because the Defence Minister, Yoav Gallant, at the time said we're cutting off all of the essentials she was asked about, and on the grounds that we're dealing with human animals. That was genocidal. I said it was genocidal when it was said, which was 3 days before she went on national television. That was cited in the International Court of Justice's own ruling in terms of the provisional orders that were then issued in terms of the case against Israel for alleged genocide by South Africa. And my own view is that means she's not fit for office. I cannot physically go into a polling booth knowing, having seen what's happened to the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people, having watched too many videos and pictures now of little kids suffering the most horrific, violent deaths and starving to death and all the rest, and put a TIG next to the name of someone who went on television and, when asked about cutting off the essentials of life, said Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism. Well, that absolute right is now being played out in front of our eyes. And I said to her, what I texted her at the time is I said to her, I've always voted Labour, this is it for me, I won't vote for you. We all have our red lines. Mine is supporting war crimes and the mass slaughter of civilians. And I texted that on the 14th of October. I would ask people to think what happened after that. Was I right or was I wrong? And I just think that should haunt her for the rest of her life. It was a moral disgrace. And I felt ashamed of ever having... I just felt warmth towards someone who would... I mean, I just don't understand what's going through people's heads a lot of the time. And I don't understand how people are not sickened by that kind of behaviour. But I would never, ever be able to vote for something like that. I just think it's beyond contempt.
Now, Emily Thornberry was asked about me no longer obviously supporting her. And I voted for her in 2015, 2017 and 2019 on LBC, which is owned by the same media company as the newsagents. Here's what she said.
Left-wing journalist Owen Jones has said he's leaving Labour. He's telling voters back the Greens and some independent candidates. What would your message be to a very prominent former supporter?
Vote Labour, Owen.
But he's just said he's not, Emily. He's leaving the Labour Party. What does that say?
It's a shame. It's a shame. I like Owen. We have our moments. He doesn't agree with me at the moment, and he's quite cross with me. But
might I ask what he's cross with you about?
Oh, one thing after another, really. And he's a constituent of mine as well. I'd like him to vote Labour because
you've just lost a voter.
I know, it sounds like it.
But you're not worried, I imagine, with your majority. Finally,
I fight for every vote.
Well, she says I'm quite cross with her. And the reasons she suggests are one thing after another. That's not really true, though, is it, Emily? I mean, if she'd responded accurately about why I would no longer be voting for her, given I voted for her 3 times in general elections and indeed voted for the party which she represents for my adult life, it would have been this honest answer. Because I went on national television and refused to condemn cutting off food, water and energy to a civilian population, despite being a lawyer, despite being Labour's Shadow Attorney General, and even responded when repeatedly asked that very basic and simple question, that Israel had an absolute right to defend itself against terrorism. And now we've seen that siege and absolute right being played out in front of our eyes, with growing famine and indeed the most sudden drop in the nutritional status of a population ever recorded, condemning the Palestinian people to mass death on top of the tens of thousands of violent deaths that have already happened because of the military onslaught that I supported. Well, it would have been honest. Would have been accurate. It wouldn't have sounded great, would it? But that's the truth. And the truth is hideous, isn't it? And I'd say it again, I do feel sometimes this kind of sense of, am I in a parallel universe? In that I understand the dynamics which have led Western political and media elites to cheerlead Israel's genocidal slaughter. So I'm not surprised. But as I keep saying, I'm shocked to my very core, because the scale of the crime is so obscene and was so predictably obscene from the beginning, based on what Israeli leaders and officials promised they were going to do, which they did. And I just cannot believe, much of the time, in the abstract, because I'm not completely naive, I understand how the world works, the level of moral depravity involved with complicity in this historic crime. Now, why this is all important is that none of this is personal. This is politics. I genuinely did really like and respect Emily Thornberry, despite having often strongly differing political opinions. I marched alongside her last year at the Stonewall, the LGBTQ, with Stonewall, the LGBTQ charity at London Pride. But to paraphrase that classic song, then she went and spoiled it all by saying something stupid like, I refuse to condemn obvious war crimes as war crimes and will even legitimise them as a Western ally's absolute right to defend itself against terrorism. Now, I believe Victoria Derbyshire is probably the best interviewer out there employed by mainstream media outlet at the time, but I would love absolute right to defend itself to be unpacked in response to a question about whether imposing a total siege on the essentials of life violates international law. What does absolute right mean in that context? That Israel can literally do whatever the hell it likes, a blank check. Emily Thornberry would say, well, actually, in that interview, she said that it was needed to be in accordance with international law, and that Benjamin Netanyahu and the President of the United States had agreed in a phone call, it had to be an action in accordance with international law. But then she refused to condemn Israel's public promise at the time of a siege, which is illegal and against international law. So what that means is her stated commitment to international law means nothing. And she naively bought into the idea that Benjamin Netanyahu was agreeing to observe international law when at the time he was very obviously not doing so. Now, a blank check is what Israel ended up getting from Western allies. Despite growing hand-wringing as Israel's overtly genocidal behaviour becomes impossible to ignore, which doesn't mean anything practical in terms of not handing over lots of weapons which have been used to slaughter innocent Palestinians. What really matters here is complicity. Israel was able to commit the mass atrocities it committed and is committing for a very straightforward reason. It was allowed to do so. Now, some will respond, well, Owen, it's one thing to call Emily Thornberry out for a morally depraved position, given she refused to condemn a siege against the civilian population as against international law and suggested in that context Israel had an absolute right to defend itself. But she's not in power. She's in opposition. But I hold her to account. True, I see where you're coming from. But the British government has power. The British government gives weapons to Israel, which retains Britain, that is, significant international diplomatic power, as epitomised by its permanent seat on the Security Council, and as the supposed closest ally of the United States, and therefore has a completely neglected leverage, and that if it departs from the US line on, say, Gaza, it would strengthen the voices of those in the United States demanding a shift in position. And in that context, the official opposition can use its leverage, in turn, over the British government, given public opinion, according to the polls from almost the start, overwhelmingly supported an immediate ceasefire. Labour could have put massive pressure on the government to, at the very least, not offer a blank cheque to Israel. But instead, the leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, went on national radio and publicly declared Israel had the right to cut off water and energy to Israel. Spent nearly 2 weeks or so having shadow cabinet members defend him over that, like Emily Thornberry, before claiming he never held such views. And well, we heard what Thornberry said, of course, in that context. Now, the British government could get away with all of this, despite overall being in a catastrophically weak political position, because the Conservatives had destroyed themselves, because Labour allowed it to. Politicians like Emily Thornberry contributed to the impunity which Israel enjoys and which gave it the ability to commit some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century. And accountability is important because the failure to hold politicians to account for foreign catastrophes, which have the West's fingerprints all over them, Iraq just being the most notorious example, allows these catastrophes to happen again and again and again. Now, I'll respond to some of the things which have been said in terms of my decision to leave Labour very shortly, which I must say often just abusive, personal, above all else, just completely refusing to engage with anything I've said for a very simple reason, because they don't answer anything I've said. But I'll just end by saying this. Gaza is being deliberately starved to death by Israel. That has been essentially admitted. Well, it has been admitted by the British government. That's my previous video. Check it out. In which the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, David Cameron, Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, goes through all of the ways Israel is deliberately obstructing humanitarian aid from getting into Gaza with the consequence of starving people to death. And now, since then, UNRWA, the main humanitarian agency in Gaza, has been forbidden by Israel from getting aid to the north of Gaza, which is the most badly hit. That's intentional starvation. It's genocidal. The International Court of Justice, in its provisional orders, ordered Israel to ensure access to humanitarian aid in order to prevent genocide. Well, Israel has flagrantly, not just ignored that order, but done the exact opposite. Which brings me back to the beginning. Emily Thornberry went on national television and legitimised that siege by refusing to condemn it as an obvious crime. And other politicians, of course, did that. It's not just Emily Thornberry. It's just, here's a case in point which was raised in that interview, which is my local MP, which is why I'm not voting for her. But we can't let people get away with that. Doesn't matter how much we like or respect them before that. This obscenity, Gaza, was a test. It was a test. It was a really basic test, actually. It was about what your approach was to humanity, to the worth of human life, to basic norms which govern international conduct, human rights, war crimes, all of these things, genocide. And some people failed badly. And that should be the end of their careers in a just world. That never again should they be listened to on anything. They've lost all moral authority. And they can't get it back. They can end up apologising. And if they come from a place of genuine remorse, but that doesn't mean they should be listened to again. Their judgment has been found to be catastrophically lacking. And that's the end of it, as far as I'm concerned. Please like and subscribe. Do share this video. Keep the show on the road at patreon.com/OwenJones84. Listen to us on the podcast. I will speak to you very soon.